We're Team Canoe Keep Up. I'm Ryan Sedlacek.
I'm Sophia Carson.
I'm Trenton Hidenfelter.
I'm Jarrett Cavenees.
If you weren't aware, we are in fact the winners of the afternoon session of the concrete canoe team for this FED. So, for our project in terms of the design cycle, it was kind of a mix of a bunch of different things, and we didn't have time to iterate on the design cycle, which really sucked. But in terms of defining, a lot of time was just spent looking at the requirements, figuring out what we're going to do, and then creating a timeline that then allowed us to get everything done. We had to brainstorm, which was a lot of just 3D modeling, which Trenton here was then lucky enough to have skills in 3D modeling, and then made our test prototype of our mold, which ended up being our final mold, just made out of 3D PLA material. And then in terms of prototyping, testing, and all the last iteration, we sadly only had time to make one test of our canoe, which thankfully, due to a professor in the constructional engineering department, Dr. Saracino, we then got really good information on a 0.4 water to cement ratio, and then we used glass microspheres as an aggregate, which then allowed a really strong concrete composition, then that we tested on 2 test molds, then we just poured into our final mold and hoped that it would work. We didn't have time to test. Our only test was at the actual FED day, and it turned out it actually worked. Then in terms of our constraints and what we actually did.
Alright, so the goal of the project is to create like just a small canoe that holds as many marbles as possible before sinking. So the size constraint is 18 inches long by 6 inches wide and then a 5-inch height. It has to be made entirely out of concrete and it cannot be flat bottom. And so to counteract that, because the flat bottom gives us a stability advantage, allowing us to hold more weight, so we made a 10-degree slope. So it was essentially flat, but technically not flat. We did have a $40 budget from the students, and it was judged on total mass carried, and it has to have a smooth outside finish. So to have a smooth outside finish, we spray painted it, and we ended up being able to hold 3.65 kilograms, which is exactly 1 kilogram more than the first place in the morning session. And so we're able to do that by making really thin walls, which the downside of that is extremely fragile, but we won. So
some design challenges we faced throughout this process was the concrete actually sticking to the mold. And we were able to counter this by pulling the concrete out of the mold. It fell apart a little bit, but we were able to glue it back together. And one thing that helped us counter this issue was actually working with Dr. Saracino over on Centennial Campus. He gave us access to this mold release wax that we painted onto our mold, and it helped the concrete slide out really, really easily. So our downfall was the mold itself actually separating and concrete filling in between the crack of these 2 pieces of mold. So a way to counter this was maybe next year, I suggest the freshmen caulk the mold or maybe cover it with duct tape to prevent the concrete from getting in between those 2 different pieces. I'd like to go over a brief timeline of when we reached out to Dr. Saracino and how we ended up using our time, I think, very wisely throughout this process. So March 3rd, I reached out to Dr. Saracino and Dr. Porgas, who are 2 professors over on Centennial Campus who primarily work in the stability of concrete, like how do we make concrete really, really strong or really lightweight. So figuring out all these ways to make concrete better. And we ended up meeting with Dr. Saracino on March 20th, which was such an incredible experience. He gave us so much advice about how to create a really strong composition of concrete. Again, that 0.4 ratio of water to cement. He also gave us lots of advice on using the glass microspheres, which we had already obtained. And we talked a little bit about using some sort of glass fibers, but we couldn't find access to these. And we ended up doing one of our test plates using plastic fibers. And March 31st, we did our initial mix of creating those 2 test plates. April 3rd, we did our final mix and poured our actual concrete canoe. April 10th, a week later, we got our canoe, and by the 12th, we had pulled it out, finalized it, broke it apart, and glued it back together, and it ended up working really, really well.
Alright, so a couple tips for next year's freshmen. If you plan on going to 3D printed mold, make sure that the prints are low inflow so you can keep them fast and not spend a week making 16 pieces. Also, make sure that there aren't any gaps in your mold. If you want to prevent this entirely, you can use packaging tape or duct tape to line it. If you do this, you will not have to coat it in polyurethane and stripping wax, which can save your budget a bit. Reach out to other groups who are using a similar plan for their concrete as you, and share materials. This way you can help both of your budgets and you can make sure that you get all the materials you need. And for releasing the canoe, expect it to break and be ready to be gluing it back together, and try to keep the walls uniform thickness so that when you glue it back together, there aren't new cracks in the canoe. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, just special thank you to everyone who allowed this project to work so smoothly, especially Dr. Saracino and all the amazing staff over at the Constructed Facilities Lab over on Centennial Campus.